Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm part of St James's in New Barnet, and I want to share some thoughts with you today about Mary, the sister of Martha, who were friends of Jesus's. And I know that Bob talked about this story a couple of weeks ago, but where he focused more on Martha, I want to talk more about Mary. So I've been thinking about some of the other Marys in the Bible. So I hope you'll bear with me as we look at this passage again, which is from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." And I guess I've been thinking in the past couple of months during this weird time of lockdown and pandemic about this verse 39. Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. And I've just been thinking about the fact that it's a really difficult time, isn't it, that we've had because of the virus itself and because of the effects of the lockdown. But actually it's also been a chance to pause and to reflect and to think about what's important. And I think it's a challenge really to see if we are taking the opportunity that many of us have to spend some more time sitting at Jesus's feet and listening to what he says. And I think it's a really hard thing to do. We have a culture that really celebrates busyness and puts a lot of kind of weight on busyness as something good. And I've noticed, and others have noticed, I'm sure that where we used to perhaps say, "Oh, how are you?" and the classic response would be, "Oh, I'm fine." Now we often say, "How are you?" and the response is, "Oh, I'm busy." And there is a sense that our lives are dominated by that busyness, and it's really hard to escape from. And so in some ways this time that we're having, this lockdown, is giving us a chance to escape from the busyness. There's a different kind of busyness, especially for those of us who are still working or those of us with young children at home, but there are moments of stillness, moments of where we can spend more time at home, more time noticing nature, more time in stillness. So I guess that's my challenge today to myself and to you is, can we use this opportunity to spend more time sitting at Jesus's feet and listening to him? Most of my childhood, my mum was very poorly. She had ME, and there would be months at a time when she was in bed. And it was really difficult times for our family. But actually, when I look back as a child of 7, 8, 9, some of my most precious memories are sitting at her bedside and reading to her. Actually, I was reading to her, but just sitting with her, not doing very much, just being together. And I think that's what Jesus is calling us to sit with him, to be with him. And that's how we build relationship, isn't it? That's how we build understanding and trust, by spending time with each other. Another woman that I've been reminded of from this story of Mary and also from the times that we're in is a woman who's known as Julian of Norwich, and you might have heard of her. She was a 14th century Christian mystic, and she lived through the time of the plague, the Black Death, and also the Peasants' Revolt, so a lot of social and economic upheaval. And at a certain time when she was about 30, she became very ill herself and actually thought she was dying. And as she lay on her sickbed, she had these encounters with God, and she wrote about them. And her book is called Revelations of Divine Love. And after that, she chose a life of isolation. She was holed up in a cell attached to a church called St Julian in Norwich, which is where her name comes from. We don't know her real name. And she lived out her days in that cell, in contemplation, in prayer. People could visit her as well, and through a little gap in the wall, she could pray for them and give them advice. But she found a calm and a stillness and a quiet in the midst of a chaotic world. And I wonder what we can learn from her. I also want to mention Martha, Mary's sister, who, as Bob was saying, has got distracted by many things, not focusing on perhaps on the big picture, on the important things. But I wouldn't want us to take from the story that she is in some ways lesser than Mary. They're both really good friends of Jesus, and he loves them dearly. And also, I think we can actually see the life that she sort of symbolises, an active life, as half of a life, and Mary, the contemplative, another half of the same life. In other words, they're two sides of the same coin, a life where we need to spend time sitting at Jesus's feet, but not necessarily just to stay there. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So first of all, I just want to reflect a little bit on what it might mean for us to, as the passage says, sit at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. What does that look like for you? I know for me, I like to spend time listening to music, praying, being still, reading the Bible quite meditatively, by which I mean just repeating the same passage and letting it really kind of sink in, chewing over the words, and spending time doing that very slowly. I also really enjoy being in nature and just noticing God's fingerprints in creation and connecting with him that way, and finding time in moments of stillness to really connect with that still small voice. So I wonder what that looks like for you. But as I say, we're not called to stay sitting at Jesus's feet. Even Julian of Norwich also spent time praying for others, advising others, and Jesus calls us to follow him. And if we look at his life and his ministry, he spent time on the mountainside, he spent time in prayer, in fellowship with his Father, but then he came down, he taught his disciples, he preached the good news, he healed the sick, he served the poor, he preached a gospel which was very active, and he calls us to be part of that. So I think I would see it as a kind of cycle where we spend time rooted in him and connected to him in those kind of practices of prayer and worship and meditation, in order to hear from him and be resourced by the Holy Spirit to go out into what he's calling us to. And I find that really helpful as an activist and a campaigner. I've been working in campaigning for social justice for the best part of 20 years, and it's quite common in that world to see people burn out from just doing and doing and doing, and becoming ill from that. And I think one of the ways we can guard against that is not just to have, as we have, this eternal hope, but also those practices, those lived out practices daily of soaking ourselves in the presence of God, of sitting at Jesus's feet and rooting ourselves in him, so that we have the resources to go out into the world. I've been thinking about it as well in terms of what's going on with the protests and the campaigning for racial justice and Black Lives Matter at the moment, which harks back very much to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and Martin Luther King, and those people were really rooted in worship and God's heart for justice, and that led them out onto the streets to call for justice here and now. And I think we can learn from that as well. So I guess that's my challenge to myself and to us today. What does it look like for you to take this opportunity of the lockdown and the period of time that we have to sit at Jesus's feet and listen to him more? And then what might he be saying? What might he be calling you to? And what action can you take?